She's Program Technical Manager in Chemonics United Kingdom Division, and she has worked on international development programs across sub-Saharan Africa before. The second panelist will be Dr. Andrew Tchie, a Senior Research Fellow at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs, focusing on sub-Saharan Africa. Our final panelist will be Dr. Shahrbanou Tadjbakhsh, a researcher and international consultant teaching at Sciences Po and Georgetown University. As I mentioned, I'm Kentaro Fujikawa, myself a fellow in international relations. I'm mainly focusing on self-determination conflicts, even though I'm not speaking today. Okay, I will pass the floor to Jacqueline. Yes.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jacqueline Grace. I'm currently pursuing my MPhil in development studies at Oxford, so I'm a student like many of you. I returned to graduate school to build on my career experience to date in peace, stability, and transition with Chemonics International. This is because I'm interested more generally in bridging the gap between academic research and development work. Chemonics International, I'm not sure if you know, is one of the US government's largest partners and a growing partner with the UK government with development projects in all sectors and extensive experience in fragile and conflict-affected states. This is where my focus lies, and both my work with Chemonics and my academic studies have centered on these issues in West Africa and the Sahel. The lessons that I aim to share in this talk, however, can be applied across different conflict stabilization scenarios and contexts. I'm very interested myself to learn from what Dr. Andrew will think, for example, given his experience on these issues in the Horn of Africa and the Lake Chad Basin. So today I want to do something a little different and look at my academic and development practitioners' work in the round. I'll draw on my academic research, which looks at contemporary conflict dynamics in central Mali and along the border zone with Burkina Faso. And I'll blend this with understanding gained from delivering conflict and stabilization work in Mali for Chemonics International. Ultimately, using these two different sources of conflict experience, I'll talk about how stabilization and peace-building efforts can fall apart if they do not take into account the role of local and informal power structures and actors in conflict. More specifically, national peace agreements, a type of political deal, can be destined to fail if they don't consider often overlooked and untraditional power holders and the pacts or alliances that they make within their communities to protect their interests. Understanding the relationship between national level factors and decisions and local level interests, what I'll later unpack as elites and elite bargains, is often critical to finding solutions out of violent conflict. In this talk, I'll demonstrate the centrality of these community interests and actors to much of today's peace-building work by first, walking you through the elite bargains and political deals theory as a means to show the relationship between localized conflict and national stabilization efforts. And second, overviewing how Chemonics translated this pioneering academic theory in Mali and how the approach can be applied to other conflict contexts. Both my professional and academic experiences have focused on how peace-building efforts interact with and can engage local power brokers. Working on both sides of the fence, research and practice, has shown me how academia, government, and development providers can work in tandem to hone theoretical approaches and improve both development policy and practice. In a nutshell, academics have a vital role to play in building the intellectual frameworks that guide development action. Practitioners must not only pilot these conceptual approaches, but share lessons learned on their applicability and effectiveness, creating an iterative feedback loop of theory and evidence. As I mentioned, this talk builds first on my most recent work with Chemonics on a pilot technical assistance program in Mali in collaboration with the UK Embassy in Bamako and the Conflict Stability and Security Fund Sahel. The project's goal was to support a group of local NGOs funded by the UK Embassy to identify sources of instability in southern Mali by helping them map where national political deals conflict with local interests. As the basis for the pilot project, we relied heavily on the elite bargains and political deals analysis commissioned by the UK government's Stabilization Unit and co-authored by Drs. Christine Chang, Patrick Meehan, and Jonathan Goodend. The theory provides a framework for exploring what I mentioned earlier about local power holders and their relationship to national peace agreements and conflict dynamics. This can be understood through the terms elites and elite bargains. An elite is someone who has the necessary means to mobilize supporters or resources to defend their local interests. These interests might be threatened by things occurring at regional or national levels, such as political deals or settlements, like the passing of a new law or the signing of a peace agreement. These elites protect their interests through making elite bargains, types of often informal alliances that can allocate power, economic resources, or even control over the use of violence. Now, I know elites is a loaded word, and the academic theory I just described looks to reframe the concept of an elite to include a broader spectrum when national legislation changed and diesel cars could not be driven in certain parts of her city, she rallied her diesel car driving readers to protect the legislation. She also connected with another local man who heads a group of London diesel taxi drivers to make a pact to park their cars in the middle of the street. And causing widespread irritation and major traffic jams in London, these diesel car drivers managed to disrupt daily life and create a political uproar. So what makes this woman an elite? She doesn't have to be a politician or a celebrity. In her case, her elite status is conferred by her ability to influence others through her blog and mobilize support to achieve certain aims. She then makes an elite bargain with the leader of the diesel cab drivers group to defend their shared interest in maintaining the right to drive their diesel vehicles. So now that we understand a bit more clearly what is meant by an elite bargain, and a political deal, we can explore how this theory is useful in conflict and peace building work. In using this approach to analyze a given conflict, you bring these three pieces together. So you holistically look at the relationship between 1, the local elites, 2, the alliances or elite bargains that form between them at the community level, and 3, pressures from the surrounding context, including wider political deals or settlements. How do these all relate? So as I mentioned previously, elites are defined by their role and not their status. So elites are people who emerge when their interests are threatened locally by other larger level political processes and settlements. In this way, we can often see local elite bargains, these pacts between different elites, arise in reaction to when regional or national level political deals fail to consider, include, or reflect certain local interests. When these elite bargains involve violence, conflict breaks out at the local or regional level despite the signing of a national peace deal. Lastly, because these elites in a society can be informal actors and seemingly atypical to include in official peace-building initiatives, they can often be overlooked. Yet because elites can be a very important source of local power through their ability to mobilize the local population in defense of their interests, they can be key to conflict resolution or stabilization efforts. Now, I know I've just thrown a lot of theory at you, and you might be wondering, what does this look like in the real world? This was the position that I was in too when I first started thinking about these concepts. How does insight gained from academic research help us to understand and tackle real world development challenges in conflict prevention and stabilization? Mali is a particularly good case study to explore this question. Since the country's independence, Mali has experienced 4 rebellions that gave rise to 4 different peace deals. The most recent of these is the 2015 Algiers peace agreement, which was signed between the Malian government and a coalition of northern armed groups. The agreement sought to restore stability in the country after the 2012 Tuareg uprising in the north and the resulting coup d'etat. Despite a signed peace agreement or a political deal since 2015, Mali has continued to experience violence. Actually, the situation has devolved into an even more protracted conflict, which has spread from the north to destabilize key central regions of the country. In fact, according to Human Rights Watch, 2019, so 4 years after the peace deal, was the deadliest year for civilians since the conflict began in 2012. How do we understand this situation? How can using academic research help implementers contribute to and strengthen peace-building efforts in this case? So using an elite bargains theoretical framework, which was the theory I described earlier, we can begin to unpack or analyze the conflict and see it through a different lens. One of the key drivers of ongoing violence in central Mali right now, which has become the new epicenter of violence for the country, are the actions of ethnic-based self-defense groups. For example, local leaders of traditional hunters from the Dogon ethnicity have organized armed self-defense groups in villages across central Mali to protect their communities. This is in the face of inadequate security provision from the Malian state and continued attacks by violent extremist groups. Unfortunately, due to a perceived association of the Fulani ethnic group with violent extremist activity, much of this violence in central Mali has involved intercommunal attacks between these Dogon self-defense groups and Fulani populations. Many Fulani community organizers have also formed similar self-defense groups in response to the security situation. This has generated a cycle of reprisal and retaliatory ethnic-based violence. In this context, we can see how the Dogon and Fulani self-defense groups are an example of local elites marshaling resources and supporters to protect their interests, which in this case is the physical security of their communities. For the Dogon, individuals who already led local traditional hunters' brotherhoods were able to use their influence. As local elites in their respective communities, they made an alliance to form armed self-defense groups, which were composed of their hunting brotherhood members in villages across central Mali. The leaders of the Dogon hunters are a type of local elite that would not necessarily have been considered at the national level, especially because they draw their power based on their traditional community roles and not through more easily identifiable political or formal structures. Yet pressures from regional and national factors, such as violent extremist activity and the Malian government's security response, threatened their local interests and led these elites to emerge in defense of them. In this case, the elite bargains that have been struck to form community self-defense groups on both sides have involved the use of violence to achieve these goals. Ultimately, per data from the Armed Conflict Location and Event Data Project, also known as ACLED, this ethnic-based violence was the deadliest cause of civilian casualties in central Mali in 2019. So thinking about Mali's future and extrapolating a bit into the past, analyzing the ongoing conflict through the lens of elite bargains and political deals can give insights into what forthcoming peace agreements or stabilization efforts must consider, as well as what has perhaps not worked previously. Unpacking and understanding at the local level who wants what and under what conditions, and how this aligns with actions or decisions being taken at a national level must be a starting point for finding solutions out of violent conflict. I began this talk by mentioning that it builds on my most recent work with Chemonics for a pilot technical assistance program in Mali funded by the UK government. As a result of this program, which sought to test the use of the elite bargains and political deals academic framework in the peace-building work of 4 local NGOs in southern Mali, Chemonics designed a toolkit. This toolkit is a practical guide about how to use elite bargains and political deals theory to analyze power dynamics and map out these elites' roles in local conflicts. It explains foundational concepts and how to translate this theory into practical peace and stabilization efforts. As we personally learned throughout program implementation in Mali, taking academic concepts and applying them to real-world development challenges can be tricky. Implementers like Chemonics sometimes need to decode academia and share the knowledge gained from this so that others can apply it to specific case studies and circumstances. To conclude, I want to make a final point about this relationship between theory and practice. Diverse development actors such as academics, government, and implementers like Chemonics can all contribute in different yet complementary ways to tackle contemporary development issues like conflict prevention and stabilization. This creates a feedback loop where academics and government can play a key role in developing theory-led and conceptually robust ideas for development programming, which is then field tested and further refined through project implementation. We can see this in the example that I've described in this talk. The Elite Bargains and Political Deals analysis was originally commissioned by the UK government Stabilization Unit, and it relied on vital contributions from governmental and non-governmental development academics and research theories. Then, Chemonics, as an implementer, piloted this intellectual framework through applying it to local conflict analysis in southern Mali, and eventually shared lessons learned on its practical applicability for conflict prevention and stabilization work in other geographic and political contexts. Ultimately, this collaboration between different development actors led to a resource which we hope will improve development policy and practice. It taught us that stabilization and peace-building efforts, particularly through national political deals such as peace agreements, can fall apart if they do not consider the relationship between national level contextual factors and decisions and local level interests, these elites and their elite bargains. Thank you so much.
Jacqueline, thank you very much. Super punctual. Okay, Dr. Andrew Tchie, could you start your presentation, please?
Brilliant. Thank you so much for having me today. And so what I will try and do within this presentation is focus on 4 areas, which is really about the challenges that exist between development and contemporary post-conflict countries, how we avoid avoid the relapse of conflict, problems when it comes to peace building, and some of the solutions that exist. And I'll try and keep my presentation within hopefully 10 to 12 minutes, if possible. I think the first thing to talk about when it comes to the challenges is that some of the challenges when it comes to development in particular are focused around the way in which not just the colonial history when it comes to sub-Saharan Africa was handed over from one colonial master to the states, but also this notion of states when it comes to the African sub-Saharan African continent. What does that mean? How has that impacted Africa? But also the conceptualization and the implementation across the continent was never one that was done by Africans. The second point really is about debt and the increased level of debt that Africans are paying. Again, and time again, we see a lot of development money that goes into Africa, but the levels of debt that Africans are bearing is a significant amount. Then really it's about, for me, the unemployment and undevelopment of Africa. So there have been issues when it comes to development, particularly the underdevelopment of Africa, that links really to infrastructure, but also the employment. We have a booming young generation of people who are very savvy, very aware about what's going on in their surroundings, but again, are hindered because there isn't enough employment for them. So that's something that needs to be addressed, but also impacts on development. And then I would say, you know, as the previous speaker has spoken about, this idea of violent extremism that is spreading across the continent, but the way in which it's been dealt with from a security perspective also has an impact on development, but also on the Africa being able to move forward. The inclusion of women and girls in society is a massive impact on Africa. We know that most households in Africa, I think the UN data is roughly about 52%, contribute to the home, and yet still women and girls are still behind in this area. And then more recently, we have the impact of COVID-19. The figures are, you know, hit and miss, but we do know it has had an impact on development, but also has stopped a lot of the developmental activities that would have taken place across the continent. And then the last thing, which I was glad actually to hear a few days ago that the UN Security Council brought forward and was able to talk about, was actually about the issue of climate change. The impact climate change has on conflicts, it has on security, but also has on development. We're seeing that in the Sahel, in the Lake Chad, and even parts of the Horn of Africa as well. Somalia is one example, and more recently we've just produced a fact sheet on Somalia, but also on South Sudan and the impact it's having in both Sudan and South Sudan and Somalia as well. So how do we avoid, I would argue, some of the returns of conflicts? I think, as the UN Secretary General has pointed out several times before, it's about prevention, and more prevention. We need to be putting in better early warning, early response, and early analysis that goes into understanding what's taking place. It's about addressing some of the socio-economic problems that exist and the political drivers of conflict, which oftentimes are not always done. As the previous speaker has spoken about, a lot of times we, as Western countries, we focus on the elites and the particular groups of people that we are able to connect to, and actually we don't have a ground up focus, which actually creates further divide between the elites, but also the people that they're supposed to be governing. So that is an important thing. I think there needs to be more of a focus on institutional capacity, or building institutional capacity from an Africa focus, and not just solely on a sort of Western European US models that have been imported across Africa for several decades and continue to be the case as we stand even today. And then it's about building good governance. What does good governance mean to Africans? What does that encompass? What does that look like? How do we achieve that? And what is the plan to be able to do that? Respect for human rights, the rule of law, are important and needs to be protected, and people need to be able to participate in the governing of their countries as well. And that's a good thing, a good thing in the long run, but it's something that we need to really readdress, because that has slipped off Africa's radar for a while now. Then really it's about, I would say, one of the areas that I think I'm slightly concerned about is this idea of consistency. We lack good consistency and good democratic leadership across the board. We see a lot of presidents, prime ministers either staying longer in power, adjusting the constitutional terms. There's issues around elections, whether elections are free and fair. There's violence leading up to it. And yet still, as I said earlier, the early warning systems that are in place need to be developed to be able to respond and prevent these conflicts before they take place across the continent. And then, as I said earlier, it's about the local established solutions, the bottom-up approach, which really looks at how we empower the local communities, the local people, women, girls, and youth, to be able to resolve the conflict and resolve the issues as well. And I think that's really important. And I think one last point before I move on to the sort of third area about the problems around peace building is about inconsistency approaches. I'll give you an example. In Somalia, there are several actors trying to deal with the security issues or the security gaps or capacity issues in Somalia, all of them using different approaches, all of them taking different scenarios, all of them playing the federal member states between the federal government, which is not helping and is creating inconsistency across the approach. So better synergy, better thinking about this, and better long-term strategy is important. And then when it really comes about why, and this is sort of the core question about, peace building and why some of that has largely failed, the sort of Western liberal democracy approach has failed. I think it's really about, we've not done enough to sustain peace. Oftentimes, if I take, for example, South Sudan, where I worked, you might have a peace agreement and people then go in and say, peace has come, and that's it. Peace is long-term. Peace is built into the institutions, into the systems, into the people's DNA. And until that happens, then we're just going to keep on relapsing into conflict. I spoke earlier about the sort of liberal models and African debt. A lot of African debts or reforms that are taking place are based upon what economists in London, in New York, or in Paris say, and not actually what is taking place on the ground. And so moving towards more models that suit the African continent or sub-Saharan African continent, and models that are able to pretty much build African, not just democracies, but economies as well, and deal with the long-term debt as well. We have an issue of elite systems, and I think that goes to the heart of what the previous speaker has said. A lot of times we import models from Europe and from the American systems, and we can see how, again, if you think about the colonial period, how that impacts on really how Africa is governed and how you deal with peace building in the long term. And then moving slightly forward, I would say more thinking around leadership. We need good leadership, good clear thinking, and a wide agenda that supports the people on the ground as well. And then it's really about understanding, for me, the weak and oftentimes underfought governance systems that are put in place. Oftentimes, as I said, development organizations view things or view Africa through a sort of lens of poverty or humanitarian relief. And because of that, there isn't enough capacity building that is done for people to be able to let go, but also transition and take over. And that's important. Two last points on this area. which is really about, for me, ceasefires. I think of the last few years, what I've seen in South Sudan and Mali is the switch between or a focus on negative peace through ceasefires. So what we seem to be focused more on is how do we, in the immediate term, stop the violence, stop the conflict, which is right. But in the long term, we don't deal with the root causes, because actually what we do is we put in ceasefires to hold the violence, but we don't deal with the situation in the long term. And so what we see is some of the success stories that we heard in the 90s of Sierra Leone, or in Mozambique, or in Angola. We're seeing resurgences of these groups coming back up because the issues and the grievances or the root causes of those conflicts have not been dealt with. And so what are some of the solutions that we could do or put in place to deal with some of these problems? Again, as I said, it's about dealing with the root causes of conflict. What are the root causes? What are the grievances? What are the issues that people feel? It's about moving away from a lens of viewing Africa in a lens or through a lens of rivalry, humanitarian case, aid, and poverty reduction, because that hasn't helped over the last 20 years. We need to shift away from international responses, which rely purely on counterterrorism and military solutions, to security, and more towards, I would argue, prevention, as the UN Secretary General has mentioned, mitigation, and long-term peace building. There needs to be more diversity and inclusion across the African continent, not just in our approaches to Africa, but also within Africans and African communities themselves as well. I think there needs to be more focus on building African institutions, homegrown institutions, which build local capacity, but also don't just focus on importing models from London, Paris, and DC. And I use these because oftentimes these locations are where funding comes from and where funding or models of supporting Africa are developed as well. And that has an important impact on the African continent. But also we need to move towards more of a people-focused and people-centered approach. And that's crucial. I think the last 2 points really about a cohesive stabilization framework. We've talked about peace building, but I think it's about more stabilization in the interim period. How do we stabilize these countries, these conflicts in the short term, in the medium term, but in the long term? And that's really about a cohesive stabilization framework that is agile in its response to conflict, violence, and security across the African continent. And then the last 2 points, we need effective coordination. COVID-19 has proven that, not just amongst African countries, but globally. We've moved away from multilateralism, and hopefully with the new Biden administration, we can focus more on this area. I think this is a really important area, but also we really need to look at how we renegotiate the African state. We have a booming youth population that do not connect with the leaders, do not connect with the elders across the African continent, and more needs to be done about how we reconceptualize and how we see a vision of the sub-Saharan Africa or the African continent itself. And then last thing I think, which is important for me and something that I've learned in my experience working in Botswana, Kenya, Uganda, South Africa, South Sudan, Sudan, and DRC, across West Africa, where I'm originally from in Ghana, is we cannot keep on recycling the same approaches and the same templates from one place to another, because they will fail. We've learned this lesson, we need to continue learning these lessons, and we need to be more aware of these failures. And if we don't, we're just replicating the same issues, and we'll be here in the next 10 years talking about the same thing again and again and again. And I'll leave it there and pass it over back to the chair.
Andrew, thank you very much. So we are going to have the final presentation by Dr. Shahrbanou Tadjbakhsh. Before heading to that, I would just like to mention that that we are going to have a Q&A session afterwards, and you can post your questions in the Q&A function. We haven't seen any, but please questions to a specific panelist. Okay, Dr. Shahrbanou Tadjbakhsh, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tadjbakhsh. Thank you very much for giving me the floor, and also thank you very much for inviting me to speak today. I think a lot of the things that were just said by the two speakers before me will be echoed in what I will talk about. Thank you also, Melin, for reaching out. Now, Melin sent a number of questions for the panel. What is, what has liberal peace building failed? Are there alternatives to liberal peace building, etc.? If I could take a moment, I just say that I have this book called Rethinking the Liberal Peace, which is exactly about the failure of liberal peace and the alternative. But I will be not, because she did specifically say that we should try not to make it too theoretical and talk a lot more about our practical experiences on the ground. So I will actually use two of my field work to examine some of the questions and the problems about doing development in an insecure situation. One comes from my work in Afghanistan, which was, I took a number of my students from Sciences Po in 2007 and 2008, and we went to the University of Kabul, which unfortunately, as you know, was attacked about a month or 2 months ago, that department. And we did a study for 6 months on the understanding of liberal peace in the context of the Afghan war. And that's findings in this book. And I will talk a little bit about that. And the second one is an example specifically about doing a project with the UN when I was working with the United Nations in Tajikistan after the civil war, trying to come up with a project which was really an example of what we should not do in this situation. So first of all, I mean, the question is always among practitioners, like, do we have to wait for peace before we do development? Or can we do development in war situations or fragile situations? Obviously, as you know, that this is no longer even a question. Development agencies, even the World Bank and even IMF are in the middle of war, because wars, we don't know whether they're ending, they're just starting, they're unending, like even Tajikistan is just a kind of an unending war. So you actually have all types of humanitarian development and long-term development agencies, finance agencies working in a situation where there's also conflict. So we do development in the middle of an insecure situation. We don't wait for peace. However, we have to remember that it is not about development as usual, that the way we do development can actually do a lot of harm in the middle of that crisis situation. And we need to be extremely aware of our own models. And Dr. Tchie was talking about the models, and I'll be talking more about our own a prioris, our own models, our own assumptions that we are taking with us when working in the situations of conflict. Now, my personal interest or passion or philosophy is people. I do teach human security, and I'm glad that Dr. Tchie also talked about this people-centered approach. I do definitely believe that that's the best way that we can actually do development in secure situations, to focus on people's insecurities, but that by itself has its own challenges, and I will talk about that. So the first thing that we need to think about is, like, our motivation. Why are we trying to develop peace? What is why are we trying to do peace? Now, in all my examples, I will take three basically kind of like lenses. The realist perspective, which is a state-based perspective. In international organizations will be all those people who are trying to do peace building, conflict resolution. Then there's the liberal institutional perspective, which is the perspective that is taken by a lot of these development agencies, right? And then the human-centered perspective, which is my answer, which is basically the local people's perspective. So, the why peace, like, again, in the context of Tajikistan, well, obviously, the international community was in Afghanistan with this a priori that we are doing this kind of peace building, state building, because that if we don't, Afghanistan will continue to be a vacuum, and it will become a security problem for us. So basically, the kind of state-based approach is we need to actually do peace building, because otherwise that country will continue to be a problem for us. And that it's a motivation that is really not very about the people. It is about us again. The institutional approach is this kind of why peace, because it's the saving of the institutions. Now, in Afghanistan, we were testing out whether, you have to, it happened in Kosovo, it happened in Tajikistan, it happened in most peace building situations. The minute that you actually have so-called a peace agreement in Tajikistan, in Afghanistan, we didn't even have a peace agreement. But right away, the checklist of institutions that need to be built. a presidential system, you have to have the parliament set up, you have to have free press, you have to have, the elections at the local level. All of these institutions have to be there. And so why peace? So that these institutions can be set up, institutions of liberal peace, right? And so therefore, and that they can also be then basically linked to institutions abroad, because the liberal system is talking about the relationships. From a human security, why peace? It would be for the emancipation of individuals who have communities, so that the people themselves have the three freedoms: freedom from fear, freedom from want, freedom from indignity. Now, whose peace, right? The second question we need to ask is what's our a priori about whose peace we are out there trying to build, right? Again, the realist approach, the kind of, is negative peace. Basically, a lot of time, you actually say, well, the state has to be set up so that it functions as a state and that it does not actually endanger other states, right? The institutional one, whose peace, the institutional liberal perspective of a lot of development organizations is about setting up the liberal peace, the cosmopolitan peace, right? A peace, a democracy, free markets. Remember the slogan, open society, open markets. This was something that actually was not just a slogan of Eastern Europe, Soros, but it's also something that was also implemented in Afghanistan right after after the so-called no peace agreement, as soon as the international community started working in Afghanistan. But whose peace from a human security perspective would be that of the local people whose security is at stake, right? What type of peace? How peace, right? How peace? The models that we're talking about. Now, the state perspective, the realist perspective just talks about minimal peace so that we can actually have minimum negative peace so that we can continue to have a functioning state. What we are seeing now in Afghanistan, for example, is about ceasefire, as Dr. Tchie was talking about, negotiations by those who are power holders, which was about negotiations between the Taliban and the Americans. That model is basically that, we're assuming that if there is that kind of a peace and then the rest, it will trickle down. Another model that at the same time was being implemented in Afghanistan was that, the liberal peace, again, how peace? By creating institutions, by creating a system of presidential system, the democracy, but that also didn't really necessarily work because the culture of democracy, the culture of the local populations was not necessarily maybe taken care into consideration. So how peace? By actually a bottom-up peace. That was exactly the word that Dr. Tchie talked about, a peace that is empowering, that is actually comes from the local people, and that protects them, but also empowers them. Now, it should be a peace that allows the participation of different groups, including the elites, including the women, including the different groups. But here's the thing, the problem when we say we are putting the focus on people in these types of situations, the question constantly comes up, but who are the people? How are they, they're fragile situations, they're fragile, so therefore they are vulnerable, right? Which I find, or they're not coordinated enough, right? Or, we also had in Afghanistan a situation where it was being said that, well, people, the local Afghans are liberal or not, and they're actually very tribal now. So, the liberal piece did not work. They didn't really understand or want this democratic institutions because they're tribal, which is a very communitarian view. And I found that both of these kinds of narratives about what the Afghans are coming from outside was wrong, because Afghans are both tribal and liberal and democratic and Islamic. And actually what we did when we did our studies in Afghanistan, we asked exactly how are the liberal values working among Afghan populations, and how do the Afghans themselves find a value in the values of liberal peace? And the answer was that we're in an Islamic society, Islam, religion, which is completely missing in the liberal peace agenda. But they would say that we are a religious society, but a lot of our religious values are also in line with democratic values. They're not in contradiction, but they need to be taken into consideration. So obviously it should be something that, the bottom up should be that we need to really concentrate, learn, and hear what the people want, and not making assumptions, romantic assumptions about the people, Orientalist or colonial assumptions about who the people are. We need to actually create the institutions, we need to get the opportunities for them to actually hear them out. very quickly, I wanted to also quickly talk about a very wrong way of doing a development project, because, well, in Tajikistan in 1992, I was trying, it was after the civil war. A lot of people the men had gone up to the mountains with their guns. There were some villages where there were mostly widows or female-headed households. And development agencies had arrived. This is, as I said, 1992. At that time, the income generation projects among women was very much fashionable, I might say. So there was a lot of donors, a lot of them from Nordic countries, interested in supporting local widows and local women, female-headed households. So that was my first project work. I was 25, 26, just finished a PhD and was just coming to the field. I said, I understand women in Tajikistan, let me do this project, although I had no idea what development was about. But anyway, you know, we assume that, well, if there are women who need income, so why don't we create this kind of income generation projects? Why don't we do credits for them? So we went to this village and asked whether women wanted to set up this kind of credit funds. And they said, no, we want potatoes. So, okay, we gave them potatoes. They planted the potatoes. They wanted the potatoes. They wanted to give us back the potatoes. We said, no, actually try to add value. They tried to sell them. They tried to make chips with them. When we said, why don't you do something with that money? So create a kind of a revolving fund, make other women work for you. So they set up a sewing factory, and they sewed like sheets for an aluminum factory. So basically we had a situation where in that village, all the women were either planting potatoes, selling in the market, or, you know, employing or being employed. Basically, economic security was much improved in that village. Everybody came from the UN, took pictures, etc. But what happened after that? The posters went up that look at how we can actually do development for these widows in a war situation. But what happened in that? I always, you know, when I tell the story, I ask my students, why do you think this was one of the worst projects ever? Of course, I mean, the punchline you won't hear, but of course the men came down from the mountains with their guns when they saw how much their women had become empowered and also rich, right? So how could we not have done a risk assessment about the fact that we are creating some more, you know, incentives for women when there are no incentives for men? Men are armed, men are not too far. And so therefore we are creating a lot more harm. And we have done, I've done some evaluations. We've done the same thing with the disarmament and rehabilitation of the Taliban. We are creating incentives in the middle of crisis situations that puts our beneficiaries even more at risk. So finally, my four last things that there, in order to really do correct development in the crisis situations, number one, we have to focus on the people, but we have to really understand what they want. So we cannot make any assumptions that they cannot voice their concerns. Ask them. The smaller the community, the better. We do have to have projects that are very small, very focused. Indicators need to be both subjective and objective, and we have to do impact assessments. We have to actually really do baselines. We have to really understand what the people want and what do they want to actually achieve, to involve them in that. Second thing is we have to understand the context. Risk analysis, what they call conflict prevention, conflict analysis or risk analysis is the minimum thing we need to do in crisis situations. And believe me, we don't usually do that. We don't have the time to do that. Third, that we need to make sure that it's not about one insecurity area. For example, in my example, we talked about the economic insecurity of women, but we forgot to address their health security or their personal insecurity when they got beaten up, their political insecurity. So you have actually within the human security approach, as discussed in the UNDP Human Development Report, you have 7 insecurity areas. They do bleed into each other. They have a snowball effect. So we have to actually make sure that we are comprehensive, integrated approach, that we deal with all of these insecurities at the same time. Otherwise, we will do harm. And finally, obviously, you have to do, as again, Dr. Tchie said, a preventive approach. And a preventive approach means that we have to build resilience and capacity of the populations themselves. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, let us move on to the Q&A session. And thank you for those who have already posted questions. And for those who have not, but who want to ask questions, please use the Q&A function. And also please use the upvote function so that we know which questions are most popular. For now, let me start. Well, okay. Let me start with the most popular question. I will read it. Thank you for the great talk. A question for all the speakers. In post-conflict peace-building settings, do you think the informal economy offers a second-best source to promote economic development and livelihood coping mechanisms? Or do you see it instead as a destabilizing force of disorder? Can you guys each answer the same question? Who wants to go first?
I can go first. I think it's a really great question. I think, like many things in conflict, the answer is both. It kind of depends. So I guess specifically thinking about the issue areas that I focus on, a lot of which are connected to conflict that relates to violent extremism or rebel groups, you definitely can see cases where the informal economy, through the ability to smuggle or traffic different items, can provide an economic and financial resource to support different groups' actions. Now, depending on the groups themselves and their specific goals in the state, in the context, that can be a good thing or a bad thing. You know, are they trying to protest against an incredibly repressive state, or are they trying to just attack and kill civilians? You know, it depends. And then on the flip side, if you're talking about communities where, because of conflict and violence, a lot of formal institutions have been destroyed, like schools have been closed, hospitals are not functioning, you don't necessarily have the option to go through formal structures. You have to use what you have. And I think in this way, like the other panelists talked about, with having a grassroots and bottom-up approach and this human-centered focus on who are the local actors and what are they able to do, trying to support them to use the informal economy or just mechanisms of creating livelihoods can be really critical. So it doesn't exactly answer your question, because I think I said both depending on the context, but I guess that would be how I would answer it based on my experience.
Thank you. I would say that the informal economy is always part of the war economies. It's always actually increases, and it's, you know, sometimes it's even the cause of the conflict, as you know, the greed model. We have to really be aware that there is an informal economy. The informal economy, though, we have to really be aware that it's a very unequal economy. It is one that actually may bring short-term gains, short-term incomes, but definitely has no job security. It's also very biased. It's very gender blind. So it's you know, it could be, it's a very insecure sector. And so we have to be very careful about like promoting the informal. But at the same time, the private sector also, which is very close, the private sector and the informal sector, but it's, you know, you have the black and brown, you know, black and gray. But I think that one problem that we have also been, the model is actually pushing the private sector as the engine of growth in post-conflict situations. And I am personally finding that also very problematic, because the private sector may be able to, again, jumpstart an economy, but in the long term, when the society is still reeking from inequalities, from conflicts, these types of opportunities actually create more incentives for conflicts. And therefore you do need to have the state actually being in there and playing an equalizer role. Otherwise it will be captured.
I'm on the fence with this one. So so from my own personal experience, because I'm not an economist, so I'll speak from my own personal experience. I think there are benefits to both. I think the problem that I have with the quote unquote liberal stroke Western economic experiences, yes, while it does work for Western societies, what it doesn't do for African societies is create the same sort of system. So what we're expecting is African countries, in particular, those who've got independence over the last 60 years, to be these sort of liberal democracies and liberal states that function economically the way most Western states function. That isn't the case, and it will never be the case anytime soon. It took most of the Western countries, if you think about the UK, where I used to reside, or Norway, where I am now, or even the US, these economies took time. But also, if you want to really look on it, then we have to think about not just fair trade, but the actual fair deal that African countries are getting as well. And oftentimes we see African countries who are producers, for example, if you take the example of cocoa, Ivory Coast and Ghana are the biggest producers, and yet still the cocoa that is taken from them is exported outside, manufactured as chocolate and other things in Western countries, and then exported back to them at almost 3 times the rate. That isn't a fair economy. So for me, I believe both systems work. I do see the downsides of the sort of more local systems in terms of it can help breed regional or national criminal gangs, drug trafficking and human trafficking as well. But also I'm in favor of, like I said, I think the system needs to be a bit more fairer. And just to touch on that point, I'll give you another example. One of the things that I'm aware of is that in the Western societies now, we're pushing for this whole climate change, and that's a good thing. It's a good, important thing, and we should discuss about it. But we also must think about the impact that that has on African countries. Where are the raw materials coming from? Where are the batteries coming from? Where are the actual materials that we're using, and how does that impact in those countries where the materials come from? So if you think about, everyone's talking about you know, electric cars and the batteries that come from there, they all come from a certain place, and that is fueling conflict on the ground. So yes, I agree that there needs to be that balance, but I'm not sure that I'm in favor of one of them. But again, I'm not an economist, so I don't want to touch to issues that I might get myself in trouble for.
Thank you very much for 3 great answers. Let us move on to the next question. With the current trade relations with China, do you see the continent of Africa heading closer to peace as well as increased development with the aid of China? For now, I would like to ask this question to Jacqueline and Andrew, but for Shahrbanou, I'm interested in a similar question, but in the context of Central Asia. Is Central Asia getting close to peace because of the aid of China or not? Yes, again, anyone can start. Anyone who is ready?
Ladies first, I insist.
Shahrbanou, can you start?
Yes, because yes, well, while you prepare for Africa, China is very much involved in Central Asian countries and Afghanistan, yes, and very much so in both processes. Now, Afghanistan we are talking about trying to build peace. Central Asia is no longer a conflict continent. It is about whether we're going to have prosperous, you know, a region, whether we're going to have a region where they will not have violent extremism, etc. It's quite complicated because I'll talk about the Central Asian one. I think that the Chinese aid, which is quite massive in some of these countries, and is quite also not coming with conditionalities, which is different from the way that the other countries' aid was. And it's very attractive for this guy. And it's also extremely immediate, building infrastructure, cleaning the roads, and like bringing hot water everywhere. So it's not about democracy building and NGOs and talking. It is really about actually infrastructure, which really is something that is very attractive to the leaders of the region. But at the same time, we're also seeing that there's also a lot of settlement of Chinese populations within Central Asia. So we are thinking that it would be, let's put it this way, it would be a future that would very much be tied to the future developments of China. It's making Chinese inlay into Central Asia quite seriously. And finally, because of the interest of violent extremism within China, there is a lot of aid going to the security apparatus too, but that is not always very clear and in line with what the Western approach is. But I'll stop there.
Jacqueline, are you ready?
Sorry, my Zoom is acting up. Yes, I can go. To be honest, I don't know a ton of information about China's involvement specifically in like peace negotiations or stabilization efforts. In my studies and in my work, I've just learned a bit more generally about China's involvement in just general development projects. I think to answer that question a bit more broadly, it's, at least from what I've seen, every development donor has a reason for why they're providing aid and why they're funding certain projects, right? And I think this gets a lot at what Dr. Andrew was talking about in his presentation around, the history of the development industry coming from Western countries and being focused around certain liberal institutions and democratization and human rights and whatnot. And I think typically how people talk about China versus the US's involvement in sub-Saharan Africa is in these kind of different development approaches. China tending to have much less conditionality for host governments in terms of specific state building or like liberal institutions that they need to adopt for their projects. The projects that I've seen, although being more focused on infrastructure and like resource related projects like oil pipelines or roads and whatnot. So I think really to answer the question, it's I think that certainly different countries, depending on their political relations with these donors and also the underlying aims for why donors are funding and supporting certain projects, can push certain countries to align with one country versus another. Yeah, I guess that would be what I could offer on the subject, but I'm curious if Dr. Andrew has anything different to add about Sub-Saharan Africa.
So from my side, what I would say is I think it does do good. So it's a difficult one because I don't want to fall into the Western category of sort of bashing China. I think yes, China and China's approach is one that is good. I think the problem that I have with it is oftentimes it doesn't deal with the root causes, because the question was really about, does it solve conflict and peace building, or sorry, conflict in the long term? And so I don't think it does, but what I think it does is it causes or recreates new forms of localized violence, because oftentimes when Chinese companies go in and they renegotiate with the state isn't negotiating with the local populations. Oftentimes they're going in, creating new laws, new policies that take land from people. So that in itself doesn't deal with the root causes of problems that already exist, but creates new problems. So I think that's the first thing. The level of debt that African countries have found themselves in, I think is worrying and of a concern. What we are seeing is high levels of debt. Some of it has been written off in some cases. Others, in other cases, it has been that certain infrastructure projects or certain parts of a state is taken or controlled by what's it called, a Chinese company or Chinese banks. And I think that in itself, long term, we haven't seen the impact of what that would do long term. I think in the long term, I think the concern that I have, as was raised previously, is really about this idea of competition, not just between, we saw it in the Trump presidency, between US, China, and this back and forth, but also what it does at the various levels. So if you take, for example, the Horn of Africa, you have everybody now trying to build a military base in the Horn, which creates all of this unnecessary amount of competition. We have piracy now that's on the Gulf of Guinea. Now everybody's running to now set up something off the Gulf of Guinea. This doesn't deal with the root cause. All it does is recreate new problems. So yes, I can see in the short to medium term how Chinese companies coming in, building infrastructure is good for Africa without the conditionalities. The problem, as I said earlier, is that when you have that sort of unlimited amount, you allow the elites who are still in control to still govern the way they currently do. And so there needs to be a balance here. We need to get the governance, institutional systems in place and balance that out with some of the stuff that China is doing when it comes to not having conditions placed on these countries as well.
Okay, thank you very much. Before we are heading to the third question, there is a follow-up question about the first question about informal economy. Were you talking about the informal economy in terms of shadow economy or more holistically in terms of home workers waste pickers, street market traders, etc. Can you guys just very briefly clarify about this?
Sure. I think my answer talked about both in terms of, I definitely spoke about the shadow economy or more like illicit economies when I was talking about how certain types of conflict activities can be funded and financed. But then when I was talking a bit about ways to try to rebuild community structures or community livelihoods in the face of conflict, I was talking about just the ways that people sell, trade, produce as a means of supporting their livelihoods and their families in the absence of more formal ways that they can participate in the economy because they're in a conflict environment or conflict affected zone.
Andrew and Shahrbanou, do you want to clarify or?
I was talking about both like.
No, the same here, both as well.
Okay, so then let us move on to the third question about militarization. The question is asking, we are faced with a growing militarization of state building / peace building assistance in conflict affected areas, with the military taking on roles previously assumed by NGOs such civil organizations. For example, military support to rule of law programs in Afghanistan. Do you see this a problem? And does this blurring of military and non-military undermine humanitarian assistance? Andrew, do you think you can sometimes deviate from lady first principle?
I can do, since the chair has asked me. So in brief, yes, I think it is a problem. We see that in the Sahel, oftentimes where there's a too much of a focus on dealing with the terrorists, dealing with the the insurgencies, and we must defeat. When we actually forget, a lot of these local groups or militia groups have formed because of the absence of the state. The state wasn't there to protect them. And we haven't learned the lessons of Somalia. So if you think about the Somalian state, how it formed, how it came about, the same example applies there, where in essence, what you have is some informal states or some informal systems that apply, but actually we think it's best to import our Western models. And so we ship in all of these troops, we ship in all this equipment, we start bombing everything, and we hope that by doing this, that what we can do is solve the issues. Well, in fact, what we then do is we disperse the terrorist groups, or in this case, insurgency groups that we did in the 80s and 90s. We make them embedded amongst civilians. And then we have a problem where the civilians then join or forcibly recruited as part of these insurgency groups. And then we complain that it's the civilians and that they're part of it. And then the local politicians start attacking them. And it's just a vicious circle round and round and round. I can't speak of the example of Afghanistan because I'm not an Afghan expert, but certainly that is the example that we see in Somalia. It's the problem that we see in Mali, in Burkina Faso. It's the problem that we probably will end up encountering at some point in Benin if the violence spreads there, also to parts of Ghana and parts of Ivory Coast, unless we learn the lessons here. And I think what is important, as I said earlier, it's about how do we do more, or how do we move towards more of a people-centered approach that is agile in its approach to security. So we need some of that security element. I'm not saying throw that out of the window, but we also need to make sure that it's cohesive. It takes a stabilization approach. And what I mean by stabilization is not just the military, it's about the development side, the humanitarian side, it's about the institutional side, it's about the human rights side as part of a package. And also, as I've said earlier, it's not about the short term. We've got to think long term here. So one of the things that I really hate is when you have people who go in and say, well, let's do this project. It's going to be 2-3 years, and then we're going to wind up. That's not going to do anything. That's only making the situation worse. So we've got to think long term. We've got to think about local solutions, and we've got to think about how we build the capacity of the local people to take over from the sort of the projects or the programs that we're trying to implement through their lens and through the way they see things. And I'll pass it back to the chair.
In the case, may I also mention about because the question of Afghanistan, because what happened is there was a model that was implemented in Afghanistan that just came right after Iraq, which is called the Hearts and Minds. And that is basically when the military starts doing development. Now, first of all, military doing development is not something that's really new. I mean, a lot of militaries in France and India do development humanitarian projects. They get called on when there is actually a fire, there is, when there is something to build. But the idea of actually military abroad as peacekeeper or our fighters, right? Or as start also doing development and governance projects was something that was again a model, which the idea came that, when you actually have an ongoing conflict and you have development and humanitarian organizations running around in insecure areas, the best way for them to actually get to those areas is to use the helicopters of the military, for example. And B, because the military is there in the local areas, they need to actually have the local populations accept their presence. And therefore, they do that through these little projects called Hearts and Minds, so that actually they can get loyalty and safety for themselves. The more they started implanting themselves in the different areas where the government could not go, international organizations could not go, NGOs could not go because of ongoing conflict, basically, and also when the donors started not trusting the local or the national government's ability to deliver at that kind of local level, a lot of donors started giving money not to development agencies, not to NGOs, but to the army in the regions to actually do development projects. The budgets of the local military, the PRTs, the provincial reconstruction teams, started it became so much bigger than a lot of the NGOs, and so for them to do actually development projects at the very local level. But here's, lots of problems came from that kind of thing. Number one, they didn't, the army is not necessarily, doesn't know what is development project, not is a humanitarian project. So basically, there were so many examples of, for example, getting the local council to come and tell them what do they want to do. So the local council would say, well, in this region, we need a bridge because there was a bridge here, it was blown up, we need this bridge. But they would say, no, actually, we have money to build you a school. Well, no, we don't need a school, we need a bridge. And so, no, actually, so, it was more about what they wanted as opposed to really what the local populations, because there's no tradition of really asking. Second, of course, the humanitarian organizations would say that now everybody's going to associate us with the army, it endangers us. There was this question of coordination. The army likes to coordinate. They're very good at coordination. I have to say the army is really the most disciplined. But then if an entire mission becomes coordinated by the army, right, by the military part, what kind of development, what kind of a peace building are we in? So it becomes a little bit problematic. And even in our interviews, even the army would say, well, are we in the peacekeepers or the fighters would say, are we here to build democracy? What is our, end goal? The end goal. Are we here? Would we leave? Would we expect our mission to be over when there is democracy? Well, where is that line? What does that mean? Because it is very unclear. So the model was very problematic, and the government of Afghanistan just put an end to this and said no more of these PRTs in. But they were very popular. There's still, I think, there are still some, but they're not doing that much development projects. So it was a model that was very controversial and by all sides. That's all.
I think it's left to me to respond. So I think I'll try to talk about two different ways, because I think that on one hand, sometimes there are security solutions to social problems, which has certainly been the case of what I've been exploring in Mali. So for example, as Dr. Andrew was talking about, with the reasons why different rebel or violent extremist organizations formed in the first place, maybe it was because of the absence of the state, or maybe actually in certain cases for certain populations, it was because they experience discrimination or a more predatory or marginalizing experience with their state, and trying to, as a way to end the conflict when you're dealing with these types of root or proximate causes through sole securitized approaches, can in fact make things worse. So in the case of Mali, obviously the French and the Malian governments have been involved with a host of other actors like the G5 Sahel, have been involved in a military response against different violent extremist groups operating in the country. And in many instances, there's been examples where certain civilians have felt targeted or victimized by the military because of their perceived association with violent extremist groups, which then led to part of this creation, as I was mentioning, of self-defense organizations for different communities. So I think it can be complicated, and it can certainly go very badly and can make the problem worse if you're trying to just militarily eliminate a conflict actor who formed organically because of underlying societal and cultural structural issues that are not being addressed, or political issues that are not being addressed. I think the other part of this question actually, though, asks about military support to ongoing development projects, so not necessarily just a military response to a conflict actor. And I think that's an interesting question. Dr. Shahrbanou talked about a lot of the things you have to consider with the example of Afghanistan. I think the only other thing I'd add where there could be a positive element is in cases of DDR programming, so disarmament, demobilization, and reintegration of ex-combatants. And I think in some cases, the military can be particularly useful when providing certain types of training for the new future security forces of a state, but also just understanding what the experiences of people who have been in active combat zones, which me being a civilian, I've never personally experienced. And I think that's a bit of a limitation in my experience. And there's several individuals, researchers I've worked with who come from the military, and I do think they're able to bring a different lens to conflict analysis. I guess the other thing I'd say, though, looping back to what I mentioned about securitized responses, I think inherently those also rely on a very state-centered model for conflict, which comes from a very Western model for how we organize our societies. And in some conflicts, the state can be a problem, or the state can be a part of oppressing certain groups of people, or the state can be an instigator of conflict. And how do you deal with that when your only avenue of pursuing particularly a security or military approach has to go through state-sponsored structures like the military? So those are, I guess, a couple different areas of food for thought with this question.
Okay, thank you very much. Let us move on to the next question. How do you see interfaith-based activism playing a role in promoting peace and stability, given its problematic past in development efforts? I'm just wondering, Shahrbanou, do you think you can start?
I'm still trying to understand correctly the question, interfaith activism. Couple of things, random thoughts, if I may. Number one is that a lot of times, a lot of the NGOs that we see in crisis situation, in this kind of post-conflict situations, international NGOs, are faith-based, Western, right? And they're getting money from the governments, their governments, right? And so the problem the problem is that, I mean, there's no problem because they have a lot of experience working post-conflict situations. But how much really is there also, besides the development and humanitarian work, a little bit of, what's the word? How do I pronounce it? Proselytization happening, yeah? Like converting people to Christianity, etc., which we see quite a lot of. We saw a lot of that in Central Asia. Done by organizations that were funded by the governments, and they were very respected development agencies, etc., etc. And I will not name them, but the big ones, yeah. So that's one, and it came to the point that the government started like banning them, but banning these kinds of faith organizations. But they came with a lot of, again, as I said, good examples of their own, development experience. The second thing is that there is also a lot of bias that we have about the question of, which faith are we talking about? Because, like, for example, the issue about Islamic organizations is a very controversial issue. Why we don't allow them to, whenever they're operating somewhere, right away we say, oh, they're there supporting extremism, radicalization, supported by this and that country, etc. But as we know, Islamic organizations also do a lot of humanitarian work, a lot of development work, etc. But again, because of the development model is being very Western, those kinds of organizations that are actually Islamic, not Islamist, but Islamic, would not be looked favorably upon, not, be very suspicious, but at the same time, the Western ones would not be. So I think that there is a kind of a very imbalance about this issue, because I would say that A lot of Islamic organizations are doing excellent job in Central Asia and in Afghanistan, but they're not at all being considered with a good view, with the West. And then thirdly, this is not necessarily related to this, but a lot of times we're also assuming that in these questions of, when there is conflicts, when extremism, etc., it has to do with interfaith discussions or interfaith problems, right? Sectarian problems, whereas the problem is intrafaith a lot of times right now, so, and that's one is something that from outside we cannot really deal with. It's not, so I see always like project proposals, or, that there could be a intrafaith, like, dialogue as conflict prevention, resolution, etc. But the problem is not intrafaith. It's not about, Islam and Christianity in these countries. It is really, it's a problem. There are issues to discuss within different Islamic strands. So, and I don't think that that's something that can be dealt with by external people from, in development agencies, et cetera, because that's something that really needs to be discussed among theologians and also populations from that faith. So these are my just a few thoughts about this.
And Jacqueline?
Sure. So Dr. Shahrbanou actually talked about something I hadn't been thinking about in terms of interpreting this question, but thinking about the role of international faith-based organizations, which I think she really highlights a lot of the pitfalls and questions to look at in the ways that these quite powerful organizations, which are supported unequally on an international sphere, can have real influence in local or country-wide contexts. I was thinking a lot about really like local faith-based organizations or faith-based activism. So in the case of Mali and Burkina Faso, my current thesis research focuses, I'm using local news articles as a way to understand how the conflict has developed. And quite often in local news articles, a lot of local organizations that are based around the Islamic faith or other cultural or religious factors are playing really key roles in having protest events or trying to have conversations with the government or just engaging with different conflict actors. And I think that in a lot of conflicts, you have to think about what identities are important to people in terms of why the conflict is happening, and work with the types of organizations or messages that appeal to those. And I don't think just coming in with an exclusive secular view of that as how peace has to happen and how peace has to take shape, when in certain communities or for certain people, they view peace, or they view social cohesion, or they view their relationships with their community and their state through their own spirituality or through their own religious practices. And so ignoring those seems to be leaving out quite an important piece of the puzzle. And also, of course, ignoring the work of a lot of local organizations that are using faith as a way to promote the conflict prevention, conflict mitigation messages, or more peaceful messages, ways of resolving conflicts in nonviolent ways.
I don't have anything to add, really. I think that both speakers have spoken to great lengths on this, and I'm not really a religious stroke peace building expert, so I don't want to touch an area that I might get in trouble for. So.
Okay, since we are running out of time, I would like to bundle questions together, and could panelists answer these questions selectively. I have 4 questions which got 1 like, so I'm going with these. First question, did democratization generally fail in post-conflict African countries? The second question, can you make sure that the engagement with elites will not result in elitism projects or approach? How can we engage with elites while keeping human-centric approach? Third question, how important is the UN Security Council in peace and security? In your opinion, do their decisions benefit all countries? The fourth one, how can we differentiate, if it's even possible, between foreign intervention and transnational solidarity? For example, Gambia appealing against Myanmar the ICJ regarding genocide? And how effective do you think R2P is? Jacqueline, do you think you're ready to start?
Sure. So I think I'm going to just pick a question that regards elites, because I'm assuming that relates to my talk, which is very focused on the word elites. So I found it a bit difficult with the theory that I talked about in my talk, some of the terminology, because I think using the word elite in terms of how we engage with it in our local conflict analysis and mapping in Mali is a bit of a misnomer. So really, I think the theory and we looked at elites as just those within communities who are able to have influence of varying kinds, and trying to get out of the limiting box of what is considered a traditional elite in terms of someone with economic power or political power or all the cultural prominence, all the other things you kind of think of when you think of like, ooh, they're an elite, and inherently just kind of trying to do a really detailed community mapping of who are the actors in a given locality who are able to assemble supporters around a given interest or a given issue that they care about. And those are the actors that we need to think about engaging with, who might otherwise be ignored when you're focusing on these exclusive socio-political administrative elites. And I think inherently in having a broader view of who are those in communities who are change makers or potential change makers, and on the flip side, who could be barriers to certain types of change, if you're moving towards more stability or peace, really aligns with a human-centric approach, because it just is forcing you to look more closely at who wants what in different communities, and those people might be otherwise marginalized. They might otherwise be overlooked by their national government or regional government, but they have a constituency who cares about what they have to say and believes that they can advocate for them. So I think in engaging with those individuals and kind of reframing what we think of as an elite inherently naturally avoids a approach that ignores varying stakeholders within a community who might otherwise be ignored in some of the more mainstream stabilization and like political deal making projects that we've seen to date.
Andrew, are you ready to answer?
I would say, so I can't answer all the questions because there were very lots of extensive questions. So R2P, I think the evidence is in itself. It's not really something that we speak about anymore. It's probably faded away. The Gambia appeal to genocide, again, maybe that's an advocacy thing, but it seems like it was strategic. Not sure what the long-term, long-term goal was there, but I'm not a sort of a genocide person on that level. When it comes to peace and security in the UN Security Council, I think there have been efforts, but I think, like I said, over the last few years, particularly with the Trump era, that has declined. I'm hoping things will change and we can focus more on multilateralism. I think there is a place for the UN, and as we know, the UN has, according to Article 51, has the oversight of international insecurity or security issues. So really it's down for the UN to be empowered to be able to do its work and not be prevented by, I would argue, particular states who sort of don't agree or don't align with other states as well. But again, it's maybe looking at the P5 and how we reform that to be more effective, which I think is crucial. Elite engagement, again, as I said in my sort of notes or comments earlier, I think it is a problem. We need to move away from that in the way in which we do those. And I'll leave that there because I think the previous speaker has said more than enough on that. And then has democracy sort of failed in post-conflict Africa? I would argue, have we actually tried it? Have we been able to do it sustainably? Have we able to do it properly? As in, have we allowed more homegrown democratic forms of governance or democracy in Africa, or the African model, to flourish? And I would argue that we haven't, and we need to give democracy a chance in Africa. just like in other places. And unless we do that, we're not going to see that happen. So I think to a degree, yes, liberal democracy has failed, but I think it's now time for more of an African-focused democratic approach to doing things across the continent.
Thank you. I will pick up exactly there. I think this word democratization, I have a problem with that, this democratization, because it's a project that, again, came out from outside as a liberal model, that democratization means these institutions in this order, this devoid of local culture, local understanding. Yes, it has failed, but that doesn't mean that democracy, or definitely in the case of Afghanistan, North Africa, or peace has failed. Peace has not failed. I think that, what we have had, almost 20 years now, it's not that they are either, yes, look, they're liberal, or no, they're illiberal and they're tribal. Actually, there's been a huge amounts of change within Afghan society. You just see the way that the young people are getting involved in their own future, in social media, in political parties, in discussions. This is something that is actually extremely happening outside of what we are understanding or what we are following from outside on Afghanistan. But that is really the beauty of allowing, that there has been, while there is still conflict, that there has been a society that has actually grown. There is peace. So there is, maybe I think I would say democracy has actually, democracy, the local favor, an Islamic democracy, whatever you want to call it, is there. Democratization as a project has failed and should fail. On the Security Council, it's interesting because I actually was advisor to the Kazakh government when they were chairing the Security Council. And I saw that the Security Council itself, when we're talking about that P5 or the others who are rotating members, it's basically an opportunity to veto each other. It's a balance of power. It is still a very old-fashioned, like it's still a something that is because the way they were set up after the end of the war. I don't think that the Security Council can do much. I think that the only way that Security Council can become much more effective is to open it up and to introduce other types of discussions within that, not just about peace and security in the traditional sense. I'm very glad that women, peace and security is now in the agenda. It is an issue of the Security Council. I'm very glad that environmental security is coming around too, but not to the nexus between environment and conflict, but just environmental security as in human security. I would very much hope that the Security Council would pick up the human security agenda away from the discussions of the General Assembly. So when we're talking about the UN, we really have to say which part of the UN. I think the development agencies or the sister agencies, they're doing a good job. I think that the General Assembly has a very interesting discussions, not necessarily actionable. And the Security Council needs to be reformed, and I hope that that will happen.
Okay, thank you very much for today's talk for the three presenters. It's already 8 p.m., so we have to conclude this symposium today. I'd like to thank the three presenters for their great presentations and also their insightful answers to the questions. And I would also like to thank attendants for coming here and also posting questions. So thank you very much.